everybody? Scuffy here, and we are going to be doing ourselves another card-by-card reboot. Today, we're doing the Salamanders. The Salamanders were the second faction in the first expansion, so that made them the sixth faction added to the game, not counting neutrals. And they implemented the powerful... At the time, I shouldn't do this. This just degrades the quality of it. But at the time, the survivor mechanic was extremely powerful because it basically doubled the health of their health pool. It made it very frustrating at the time. There was a Vulcan event. We're going to go through some of these changes, kind of see how these cards have changed. What's good? What's bad? What's worthwhile? What has been implemented and improved on by new neutrals, as well as what has been relegated to the sidelines since the Salamanders debuted. So starting into that, let's get into the collection. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the Warlords. Now, Artellus Numian, he's gone through a couple changes. Initially, when he first came out, his ability cost 2 energy. He gave Survivor 1 to a friendly infantry or Astartes. That hasn't changed as far as what he does. He gives Survivor. The Salamanders as a whole didn't get a whole lot of press release following their initial debut because quite quickly after their debut, the whole faction, I can't say the whole faction, the Primarch, Vulcan, received a significant change that turned a lot of people off. The pacing of the Salamanders as a whole just kind of felt too slow, even by those standards at that time. So there was a wave of Salamander changes that took place roughly after we were still deep in that expansion because the Raven Guard were out. But Vulcan didn't receive a change, but Numian was the warlord who did receive a change. He got his ability lowered to 1 energy. In addition to that, he started the game with an additional card, which at the time was kind of like the way that they handed things out back then. This is before initiative got changed, or was added to the game, I should say, before initiative was added to the game. So as a token of rewarding those warlords that weren't performing well, besides changing the initiative, they would simply give them an additional starting card. Erlin is an example of this. He had that taken away. Loken might be an example of this still. Numian was one of those such warlords. He's since lost that additional card because giving Survivor 1 on 1 energy, especially to so many neutrals that have been added to the game. The primary offenders have always been the Farron's Militia. However, a first turn Kai's Elaine with Survivor can be very frustrating. And it could throw a whole game, for that matter. He could have the Survivor just stacking on to the Secretary Axiarch, who already has Survivor, recurring that, as well as many of the cultists that came out with Cygnus, particularly the ones that were sacrificed, because if they've got Survivor, it still triggers. Sacrifice effect triggers. If they have backlash does not trigger with the Survivor effect. So that's important to note. And so Numian got pinged a little bit because not only did he get adjusted, because as a result, anything that you put in the Salamander's pool, Numian could prolong and keep around longer. So in order to improve the Salamander's card pool, and there were some minor improvements, they had to tone down Numian. And so they took away that additional card. He's still very effective. If he can get the ball rolling, he can be very frustrating against. He also has Survivor 5, which is nice. He's a good, solid starting warlord. The faction as far as the faction goes, they're hit or miss. They're not forgiving to a new player, but they can be a decent new player experience. But when you have a warlord ability like Artellus Numian, he can mix very well with a wide variety of neutrals, which actually makes it easier for a newer player to function. So if you're looking to get into Salamanders and you don't have any, Numian is actually a decent warlord to start off with. Don't let his 30 health fool you. He's got a solid ability, and it can be very quickly become a problem for your opponent. Many players, long-time players as well, have quit games because Farron's Militia got stuck with the Survivor on that first turn, and they didn't have a response to it, and they just give up. That's not always the case. I always recommend people play the game all the way through, but that is often the case. Cash and Vaughn. Now, I did a video a couple months back on Cash and Vaughn when they released the Twice Dead effect for him, which is a nice little effect that he did not have initially, that allows him, after his survivor gets triggered, so it's kind of like a little mini reckoning. You play this for 1 energy, and then it reduces the cost of all the troops in your hand by 2. It heals 5 to your warlord, which means theoretically he should have 10 health if your survivor hasn't taken any damage, as well as some cheap troops. His ability has not changed. His initiative has not changed. The Salamander's counterattack is decent for him, and that's okay, but that twice reckoning, and if you take a look at the video that I did, I'll see if I can recall, put a link to it in the comments. That actually functions really well with some of the standard neutral troops, but it certainly could work well with some of the newer neutral troops. More the high cost, not necessarily low cost. I mean, when I say high, I mean like 5 or 6, because they're solid. Getting them for cheaper, you can put out few. You don't have to put out a lot of big fat bodies. You want to be able to fluctuate and drop 2 or 3 units with his ability. So having a beast of fire is okay, but having something more like along the lines of the vehicles that the Mechanicum offers, personally, I prefer that more. I think that's a lot more functional, whether that is, Sagittarius Squad for 2 in conjunction with a cheap Skitarii Protector frontline for 3, and then you still have enough energy to play something still backing it up, like Remare. I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but just the same. I like Cash and Vaughn. He's difficult to play. He is difficult to play, and you have to know what you're doing with his deck. I think a lot of the neutrals that benefit from the Twice Dead were neutrals that had been in the game for a long time. You could argue a Cash and Vaughn deck, or even a Numian deck, could work very well with Desperate Defense, which is seeing a lot of play, more so with Vulcan, and we're going to get into Vulcan here in just a little bit and explain why it's so effective. But this is just a solid card in terms of putting in 2 random troops, giving them frontline, and the fact if you're playing Vaughn, you may end up having some more higher cost cards, and if you don't get your Desperate Defense out, you can still use his Twice Dead if you need to lower the cost, so you're still able to play more than just 1 troop a turn. His ability is okay. It can be effective. It's primarily effective in terms of comboing with Ash and Bones, because for 5 energy you can destroy anything that doesn't have ward. But I personally would have rather seen this be ability changed, where this was an Act Again ability, or it cost 1 less energy, because it's a very slow, very plotting, methodical deck, which feels like a Dreadnought with a heavy flamer should. However, it's not perfect. I think it's not for everybody, and it does play at a certain pace. Now, speaking of decks that are not for everybody, what? A 75 win rate with Nemetor? I need to change that. That needs to get higher. It's only 4 games. It's not much. But here is a warlord who came out. He was the 4th warlord for the Salamanders, so he was an event. He was rewarded after an event. You'll note that he is a warlord who does not have Survivor. A lot of people still kind of complain and moan about this. His ability has been changed 2 or 3 times, all of them with not good success. He doesn't have Survivor because, unlike the other warlords in the Salamanders faction, Nemetor did not survive Istvan 5. Thematically, it makes sense. His ability is all about not protecting his troops, but incentivizing your opponent to not attack your troops. It actually works very well with troops that have sacrifice, or troops that, in the same way that you would put in a Shapura deck or a Decane deck, giving your warlord frontline, kind of plays the same way. The added bonus is, even if you don't have frontline, your warlord has 4 attack, and if you're facing a warlord such as Angron or Kabanda, your opponent is going to get punished, whether they attack your lower attack troops or they attack your high attack warlord. The problem is, he doesn't have a Reckoning or a mini Reckoning. He doesn't have Survivor, so you really have to have support cards in there to boost his health and really fluctuate on that, as well as cards that are going to draw your opponent's ire. That's just a favorite tactic of mine, is playing troops that your opponent can't ignore. That's a good tactic all around. And if they do that, that prolongs your life. It also goes hand in hand with your ability. The fact that his ability is 1 energy is nice. It used to cost 2 energy. Then it cost 2 energy before, and it just gave him +2/+0 and like 1 damage to a random enemy. It's not good. Its ability is completely reactive on what your opponent is doing. And if your opponent is playing a game where they're not going to attack your troops, they're going to use tactics, this ability doesn't do anything. If they're going to sit back and use like a captured Mandragorax, oh, we've got a deck submission. Awesome. Quick shout out, interruption, pause, Nemetor. Yeah, we've got 24 hours for the deck list submissions for September. That's the Calf theme. Thank you for the reminder. And the deck submission, awesome. We're in the double digits here for this. It's been a relatively slow month for deck list submissions. I think a lot of people are awaiting the new expansion. But yeah, his ability is really reliant on your opponent attacking. And if your opponent is using a warlord that has got like Erlin's ability or captured Mandragorax ability, or they're playing tactics from hand, or they're stunning, you're not going to get anything out of this. And that's really where the frustration comes from. That's really why he doesn't see a whole lot of play. Also because that is a common playstyle, and that is a trending top playstyle. Has been for quite some time. So in terms of Warlords collecting, sure, playing for the memes, yeah, but playing as far as possibility goes, I'd pass on Nemetor. I'd recommend a player to play Numian or Cash and Vaughn, or go right to the top with Vulcan. Now, Vulcan plays a lot more stable. He's got the Primarch health pool. He's got Survivor 5. He's got a Reckoning. And his ability, after a very long time, was changed to give him the option to put out a troop, the Sorkar Hunter, or get a teaching. For the longest time, it was just pay 2 energy and get a random teaching. Teachings aren't fantastic. We're going to take a look at some of those. We're going to take a look at all of them, but they're not fantastic. They're okay. They support troops for the most part, so you need to have troops in play. So the fact that he has the ability to just generate Astartes, that's nice. His Reckoning mode is actually one of the best, in my opinion. It's the easiest to get. Eventually, if you're a decent player, you can predict it and you have to work around it. But it gains Survivor 3. It ups his attack to 3. It doesn't change his ability at all. That's what's very interesting about it. And that's what I actually like about it, because you're not building for a Reckoning build. If it happens, it happens, and your game plan can stay exactly the same. The only thing that changes for him is his attack goes up. He gains Survivor 3. And this happens repeatedly. So this is the only Reckoning that can continue to trigger. And your opponent then has to time their strategy in terms of destroying your Survivor and dealing an additional lethal. Cards like Manifest Destiny can certainly throw that off, but also the new card Atham, which can throw on just an additional 2. And this is after the change to Atham. Before, you could put it on him and just, pay your ability to generate 1. So that would actually change his Warlord ability. Now you don't have to worry about that. You can keep the Warlord ability, just throw on a quick Survivor 2 to your Warlord. It works out really well. Now, in terms of double defense, Desperate Defense. Why does Desperate Defense right now with Vulcan so popular? It's popular for a variety of reasons. We're going to see a lot of this in the Salamanders card pool with decent, not overly powerful, but decent stat troops with Survivor. That's nice. Having Survivor on a front line is fantastic. But also Vulcan has the ability to put out troops early on. He has that long health, so he's got a long game reach. So naturally, he's already put into that camp where he can play the long game. He can build decks. He can survive that long and get to that 10 energy. And as a result, he can boost what goes down. He can outlast, get to that point where he can throw down things, and then he's protected by the front line. And on top of that, if you need to, once you have troops on the board, you have the ability to create teachings to further stimulate or support the troops that you've played. And that is really kind of a trifecta of factors that make Vulcan Desperate Defense so good. Now, there are other Desperate Defenses builds, and they all have similar concepts in different ways, whether that be protection of those units that get pulled out via effects like ward, or they already naturally have survivor, or some things that have flank, for instance. But it feels like a natural fit for Vulcan, and it works very well. Now, granted, I'm talking about a legendary warlord and just a single rare, but that rare has made many decks, Salamanders included, work very well. And again, it's harder to do with Numian. You could make it work with Numian, though. You could make it work with Numian. You just have to tweak things a little bit. I think Cash and Vaughn would be the better, like if you don't have a Vulcan and you want to try it out, you could do Desperate Defense with Cash and Vaughn better, because also he's got the twice dead effect. So even though you may not be able to support the troops in the same way, your options of dropping additional cheaper troops does exist. So Devotion is one of the first teachings we're going to take a look at. And this is the cheapest, basic. It's kind of just subpar okay. It's a common. It's not something you would put in your deck, because there's just a lot of other tactics that boost cards better. And if you're Vulcan, you could create this for free just naturally. So why include this in your deck? But it gives +1/+1 to a friendly troop. It's okay. It's not something I'd put in the deck. Sorkar Hunters is also not something I'd put in a deck. Thankfully, with Vulcan's ability, you can create these guys. And that doesn't seem odd. You're paying 2 for his ability to create a 1 energy troop. That does seem like a little bit of a throw-off, but the fact that he can always do that is really where the value comes. As opposed to just having 2 of these in your deck, you have a unlimited supply of these if you so choose. Benevolence, I think, is honestly my favorite teaching. It's the best teaching. It's very simple, but it's very solid. The artwork is nice too. Healing 3 to your Warlord is good, but then also to your adjacent troops. And this is one of those cards that can really bolster a Desperate Defense deck, because even if you don't drop a massive health unit with Desperate Defense, or you've got a frontline Salamander with 5 health, you can afford to attack with your stuff and then use Benevolence and heal them back up, almost in the same way that Death Guard can with their Endurance tactic. It works the same. There's nothing more frustrating when you're watching your opponent attack. You're like, okay, he's leaving himself vulnerable. I can destroy those. They got 2 health. I got an artillery strike. Oh, he played Benevolence. Dang it. All right, well, back to the drawing board. That's really what this card does. This is one of those few teachings that I would include in the deck. I would definitely include it in Nemetor, because he needs the health. But it's worth including in decks for the 3 health. It's not a auto staple. It's kind of just depends on if you can squeeze it in, but it's a very solid teaching. Like I said, I think that's one of my favorite teachings. Cortan Squad is a waste, I feel, unless you can get Survivor on them with Numian, and they're just not that great. They're 3/1, so for 1 damage, a frag grenade or a random, defensive satellite, you're going to lose these guys, and the fact that they don't have Survivor hurts. Their ability got changed a little bit to deal 2 damage to a random enemy. I believe at first it was like 1 damage, and that's all it was. So it was really low value. Honestly, I prefer the value of Cultist Acolyte. Even though it's a 2/2, it deals 2 damage to the enemy Warlord, which I'd rather have than random. I just would rather have direct damage than random damage. That's just my personal beef, yes, but that's the way it goes. Plus, with the 2 health, a hit and fade from the world leaders isn't going to kill this card and give my opponent a free card. So I just see it that way. Harmoken Squad, I like these guys. I want to like them more. The fact that they're a 1/3 is very low value. They've got 1 survivor, which seems okay. Their ability is decent cost, 1 energy to deal 1 damage to an enemy adjacent unit. So it's technically 1 energy to deal 3 damage across the board. That's nice, but the low stats really throws me, because here's the thing, and I don't like comparing cards from Legions to Legions, but here we've got a card here. Thematically, you've got a Flamer, you've got a Survivor, and then right over here 2 Orphans of War, who've got a guy who just does this randomly for free and has got Survivor 2. Don't have to pay anything. It feels like this card is outdated a little bit. If this was a 0 energy ability, I would have no complaints. If it had 2 Survivor or even 4 health, I'd feel a little bit better about this. I don't mind the 1 attack. I just feel like the ability at this point, as the game has shifted, these guys I just pass on, including in decks. They've got a place, but it's harder to make them work when you could go with other neutral cards that just automatically are going to do rally effects, or cards that are going to put pressure on your opponent. Just having anti-stealth, these guys have been around for a while, but the Secretary Axiarch, change of allocation of stats, but these have a major impact in terms of your infantry. And if you're playing Numian, who's got Farron's Militia or other infantry you're supporting, they just work better. It's harder to justify including Harmoken Squad in there. Now, Hope is not bad. Hope can be good. Hope should be good. In fact, if you've got two or three troops on the board and you give them sacrifice, draw a card, that is really nice. That's really cool, because the Salamanders don't have a lot of card draw, so it's a way for them to refresh their cards. If you're looking to include a way to get card draw and you've got a lot of troops in your deck, a couple hopes is not a bad idea. It's not bad if you generate with Vulcan. It's not required. There's other ways to go about it. You can just go with the Lectitia Divinatus or take your time building up a board. But this is one that sometimes can swing a game when you play Hope and your opponent and you're able to draw 3 cards from your sacrifice effects. You do have to have that set up though, so it's contingent. Cost-wise, it makes sense. It's okay. Now, something I want to mention here while I'm talking about sacrifice, the entire sacrifice mechanic. There was a I don't know if they confirmed it as a bug when the sacrifice came out. It was actually around for a couple events. It was problematic. What would happen if a troop gained sacrifice? Like if I played Hope on a troop and the troop was returned to my hand, the sacrifice effect stayed on them. Why do I say that? Because there's a sacrifice effect that no, it's down here, down the ways. Here we go. Resilience. Resilience used to be give a troop sacrifice, return to your hand. So you would have your troops sacrifice, deal whatever their sacrifice was, draw you a card, return to your hand, keep all those abilities, play it down again. You could stack your sacrifice. It was kind of a weird bonkers thing. And at the time, Goldstone Hunters was 3 attack or 3 health. So a lot of decks were using Goldstone Hunters and giving them resilience and hope, and then using them to attack into their Warlord or the big beefy, deal 3 damage, draw a card, Goldstone goes back into hand, you're playing the Goldstone Hunter again, does another 3 damage, draw a card for 6 energy because you've already stacked the sacrifice effects. It was just bonkers. It was bonkers, and it went on for, like I said, a couple events before they finally tweaked it because it wasn't intended to work that way. I don't think they confirmed that it was a bug because it was across the board. The sacrifice effects were staying on cards even after they were returned to hand. Now, Orbital Combat, I like this card. I want to like it more. I wish that this card dealt some damage, and I think that's really what it comes down to. It's very solid anti-tactic play. The Salamanders need that to protect their bodies. I think at least one of these is recommended in Salamanders decks. If you want to include 2, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. The fact that it draws you a card is fantastic, so it replaces what it drew. You are creating a higher cost on your opponent's side than what you're paying for your turn. You're paying 2 to increase something for them by 3. As long as they're playing tactics, that's going to have an impact. However, I do wish that this dealt damage as well, in addition, because I feel like the Salamanders as a faction lack the rally damage effects or instant damage effects within their faction, and they really have to rely on neutrals to fill that void. Now, Promethean Gift was changed recently, finally, reducing the cost of 1 for abilities of all troops in your hand and deck. Before it was just in play, which you had to put a troop in play, and then you could play it, and then it would reduce their cost of their burners. This would become to a 0, but he had to stay alive to make it work. This is much better now, kind of inspired by the Iron Warriors with their attrition warfare and their harsh discipline, but the attrition warfare, increasing the stats of everything in your deck. Playing this card early on with a deck full of heavy flamer troops that we're going to see here can be very powerful because then you can play their abilities, retain your energy pool, and drop more support cards. So it's a better card. It's suited for a very specific deck. It should be noted, I like using this. And this is not a new neutral, but I've done it, and it's really fun when you can stick the old Father Decay and stick that Father Decay out there and then have his ability cost 1. Now imagine that if you get Father Decay with your Desperate Defense. 14 health frontline, demon with a 1 energy, putting in more troops for you. That's the dream, baby. That's the dream. It works really well. It should be. It's not a new neutral, but it is a neutral that thematically doesn't make sense, but in terms of gameplay, in terms of bolstering the way that the faction works. I mean, if your opponent's waded through all your survivor troops and they think that they're good, and then you bring out Father Decay and you start bringing them all back, you start bringing back Roshan squads for 1 energy, and you get like 4 random Roshan squads. Now these guys are a staple. Roshan Squad is a staple for the Salamanders. Do not despair. Do not think that it's not. This ability got a little bit better. I think their sacrifice used to just deal 2. And then they upped the damage and just made them more solid. They draw heat. They draw fire away from your Warlord, which again is a strategy for specific Warlords. But then they just exchange really well. In the event that your opponent cannot respond to these guys by themselves, they can deal 5 to 10 damage or more if you give them repeat survivors with Nubian to your opponent's Warlord direct. That's fantastic. That's just a solid card. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Sorrow is okay if you're looking to include a few decks, like if you're doing a Desperate Defense build and you want to throw a Survivor 1 on a Doombringer or a Fleet Admiral Kyra. It's okay. If you're playing Numian, you can pass on this card. If you're playing Vulcan, you probably can pass on this card because you're going to create it because it's a teaching. So I'm okay. I'm ambivalent about it. I don't have a huge pro or con about it. I do feel that Storm Eagle, for the most part, feels like a 2 of in my decks, the way I play. It's one of the few, it's actually the only Salamander's direct damage card. It's very low damage, but the fact that it stuns is really the selling point for me, because being able to stun your opponent's Warlord or key troop when you play a troop that has a survivor or a sacrifice element prolongs or increases the effect of you, or chances of you keeping that troop on the board, and that's super important. Doesn't mean it's critical. Sometimes you can just play Storm Eagle as a defense and buy yourself a turn, but it works very well for that purpose, for that specific purpose. So I do like that. I think it still resonates. It still carries weight. Now, Antitar does not. I used to like Antitar, and I know people still play it from time to time. It still is out there because it feels like, oh, you know, that's a great sacrifice effect. And it is. It is a great sacrifice effect. But their stats, and as the game has progressed, this just is low, subpar, mediocre. 2/4, they can be returned to hand with Melgator. They can be destroyed with a variety of effects. They're low cost. That's great. But you really want to play these guys late game to destroy a troop, specifically the big powerful troops. And if you're playing them late game, then that 4 health is not going to mean much of anything. So they really, as time has gone on, I have weaned these out of most of my Salamanders decks. I just don't feel that they contribute. I would rather have a tactic that I can play that's going to draw me, is, you know, some of the classic stuff or some of the newer stuff, the stuns, or can help remove stealth. It just feels like, or more recently, this effect, which is a little bit more random, but because I've got survivor troops, and if they happen to take 4 damage and don't die, I can trigger the sacrifice, or if they do breaks their survivor, then they're still alive. Short story, long story short, short story long, Antitar is outdated. They don't fly for me. So as far as Epic goes, if you need it for a collection, sure, but I don't include them. I don't recommend hunting them down. There's better cards to go after. Artificer Armor is I'm surprised it's not a teaching, to be honest with you, given the fact that Vulcan created armor. That was half his thing, but I get it. I get that it's a tactic. It's just okay. I think for the big thing for me, it's not bad. It's one of those things that can bolster. Again, we go with Desperate Defense. That's just the deck right now that has seen play. Making a 14 health Father of Decay 28 health, I think, is self-explanatory. But that's all it does. It doesn't do anything else there. And for the most part, if you're playing generally just Salamanders, you don't want to bolster their health too much because you're playing with sacrifice. So if you double the health of this 4 Roshan Squad to a 4, which is a bad example to use, but if you did, you might not be able to trigger that sacrifice so much. If you did this with your Epistolary to make him a 6 health, you're definitely not going to trigger that sacrifice as often. So it just is okay. I'd pass on it unless you're not playing with sacrifice, or you're playing the Desperate Defense. Maybe you want to throw in one of those. It is a bit high cost though, but if you trade it up, it's worth it. Ash and Bones is their hard removal. Then the troop has got to be damaged, and it's less effective with Ward, obviously, because you can't target them. but it's very good. It's a 3 energy cost, so there's a good trade-off there. It lines up with other 3 energy hard removals. Depending on your build, you may pass on Ash and Bones if you have got one of the legendary hammers, for instance, and you're running Vulcan. If you're playing Cash, and you should have 2 of these. Otherwise, I'd recommend at least 1, just because hard removal is always a good option. Again, here's a straight way effect versus a random sacrifice effect, and these are the same cost. Yes, one is a troop, one is a tactic, but they're within the same faction. Why would you choose one over the other? A long time ago, you might have said, why not both? And that would have been a decent answer, but that's not necessarily the case. It's a good card. It's a great common. The fact that it is a common is a good selling point. Now, Chaplain Xavier, I think, is, in my opinion, I think he's one of the best, maybe the best legendary in the faction. A lot of people will argue about the artwork, indicating that this is more 40k armor pattern versus 30k armor pattern, and the name. I like the artwork. I think the artwork is nice, regardless of which pattern of armor it is. The ability is, it makes him a target, though. If you cannot give Chaplain Xavier protection via frontline or sacrifice himself, he's not going to stick around, and you're going to get 1 use out of his ability. But being able to give survival 1 to 2 troops, especially troops that have just used their sacrifice and their survivor, or that have got low health and you want to keep them around longer, he's really good mid-game, late game. If you can get him to stick early game, even better. I just really like him. So I'd say, in gems wise, he's worth picking up in the shop. Eigen Gargo, I like the idea of this guy working. For his cost, he can become a 4/4 frontline, but that's it. And you have to have infantry troops. Now, for the longest time, that hasn't been a thing that really works very well with the Salamanders. But recently, I think with the new, Cygnus acolytes and the cultists from Cygnus, Cygnus fanatic, as well as a couple of the Eightfold brand, you can have a lot of infantry to help give your Ignis, or Eigen or Eigen, I'm going to say Eigen, give him the chance to get a 4/4 frontline. But the problem is that's all he is. He just becomes a frontline at that point. He doesn't have any other effect. He doesn't have a sacrifice effect. He doesn't have a damage effect. So you have to weigh the cons. I mean, granted, if you're protecting, cultists and demons, then maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe you want to go with something different. He just kind of feels weird to fit in there, and I'd rather have other cards. Jur Tactical Squad. Now, these guys do it better than, for obvious reasons, cost-wise. These guys cost 2. Harmoken cost 2. And Jur cost 3. They get a little bit more attack. They get a little bit more burn. They have the same cost. That's not bad, and if you can give them the Survivor, that's good. I think these are just a solid, common card. No hate here. Good card. Nocturne Born is a tactic that, a long time ago, it was really good. I think it just was like, give you Survivor 1 to a friendly unit. If your opponent controls more units, return this card to your hand. Seems self-explanatory. You could get 2 or 3 uses out of it, and you still can. But at the exchange rate that the game is at right now, and the speed that this is at, you're paying 3 for Survivor 1. And again, Atham, which has recently been changed, and this is just a one-time use, but this is 2 for 2 versus 3 for 1. There's a big difference there in what you're paying for and what you're getting. And I just feel like not Orbital Combat, but Nocturne Born feels like it's overcosted for what it does. If it cost 2 and did the same effect exactly as it was, I'd be okay with it. Or if it gave Survivor 2 for 3, I'd be okay with that as well. Even if it didn't return to hand, just the fact that it was more Survivor for the Salamanders. The fact that this can go on any friendly unit is an upsell. It doesn't have to go on your Warlord. It can go on a troop. It can go, which can be a vehicle or a structure, but it's not great. And if you're trying to protect your troops because you're out control, because your opponent has more units than you, you're not in a good position anyways. And this feels like instead of playing this card, you should be playing more troops to better defend yourself. Resilience is terrible. It was somewhat bad to begin with when it gave your sacrifice troops return to hand because you had to replay them. It got worse when they gave this effect. Just don't do it, guys. Scorched Earth, deal 2 damage to all units, has its place. If you are doing a massive burn deck, you could certainly put in Scorched Earth and Volcanic Instability and Planetary Purge, Rain of Fire, all the burnies, all the burn tactics. This helps trigger sacrifice to some degree. It's actually really good as like a clutch surprise, especially if your opponent's got a wide board of troops that are low on health. But it damages your stuff too, so you've got to be ahead of the curve. Now, works really well, not to be noticed, this works really well to help Cashin Vaughn trigger his Twice Dead. It's a nice little clutch card, so keep that in mind if you're doing a Cashin Vaughn deck. But it's kind of, you really have to feel your deck out and decide if that's something that you want to include in it. Atoc Abedeme, I think these guys are mandatory, and I say mandatory, their low attack doesn't make them so great. The fact that they have frontline, 4 health, as well as 2 survivor is really what makes them solid. They can survive a breach, and they still have frontline, and they're going to still require some other follow-up action. And you can bolster them. Yes, they can be returned to hand by Melgator, but they're a 4 cost, so that's not too terrible. They're just a good card to have, whether that is protecting your Warlord or protecting the troops that you want to play, such as, Chaplain Xavier or some of your sacrifice troops. These guys feel like you should have 2 of in every Salamanders deck. They just have a high value. You're paying 4 for essentially 8 stats. You're getting 2, 2, and 4. So I see that as a good upsale. Now, Dragon Scale Shield thematically makes sense to me, but I see it as just overcost. I've tried. Shield is nice, and +0/+2 and Frontline is nice, all in one package. But if you're paying 4 energy for that effect, you've got to be putting it on something really solid. And if you're playing it on something really solid, why aren't you just, if you got 8 or 9 energy at that point in the game, you should be playing another 8 or 9 energy troop. This feels more like a, pardon my pun, but more of a weak defense than a desperate defense. This feels more like a card that you could deal damage against your opponent and take out their troops, rather than bolster something and hope that your opponent doesn't have a hard removal or a stun or some other effect. So Dragon Scale's a pass. Now, Epistolary Reston, these guys' attacks were originally 2. They were 2/3s. They had to be changed to 3/3s after the Night Lords emerged, because the Night Lords' rule of fear just devastated the Salamanders as a whole. And it just felt unfair to drop these guys and then just have them straight up destroyed. So their attack is 3. They can still be destroyed that way with some other combinations of cards and or abilities, but it requires a little bit more. Their Survivor 3 is just great. Their sacrifice is solid. These guys put pressure on your opponent, and usually is what your opponent will save their Ambassador Melgator for. In a Salamanders matchup, that's really who you're holding it off for, is to return these guys to your opponent's hand, because it's really going to thwart them. Because if you're bringing these guys out at 5 energy or 6 energy, then at that point, as much as their stats are decent, they are easily disposed, versus they're more easily disposed of. Gardos is another good one, and I like this. It's got Survivor 2 instead of Survivor 3, and instead of a sacrifice, he's got a burn ability, but it works the same way. It works the same way, and it's very effective. There's nothing to dislike about this, except for the fact that it's a vehicle. And I say that with all love for vehicles, but the fact that it doesn't work with Numian. His ability cannot give these guys additional survivor. You've got to rely on cards such as Chaplain Xavier or Sorrow to keep them alive longer, or you just bolster their health or keep them behind frontline. So there's ways to go about it, and if your opponent can't get rid of them, they're going to have a hard time. They're going to have a hot time. Kogoski Squad, dislike. The Imperial Army troops have not gotten any better. Most of the Imperial Army troops that have come out have been vehicles or tactics more than anything, tactics that create troops. These guys just feel, for their cost and for their rally effect, they're not doing damage. They're bolstering cards that you might question yourself why you're including in your deck to begin with. Pass. Barrack Zytos is good. It's got a solid frontline. You'll note that he does not have Survivor, but you can give him Survivor. His sacrifice is very strong, but he's got to live in order to make that work. There was a time when I used to include 2 of these guys in decks, especially Numian decks, because Angron could not stomach getting rid of one of them. Or if he could get rid of one, he wouldn't have enough to get rid of 2, and then I could cycle the Zytos over and over again if he's not drawing Conqueror, and punish him repeatedly. But the game has sped up beyond that. Zytos is a 1-of, I think feels more relevant, more likely. Still a very good sacrifice, but more of a speed bump. And with so many unstoppable warlords now, Sanguinius, Kabanda, Korax, and there's one more in there I'm missing. Rom. It's hard to justify a lot of front lines to protect your little guys versus having bigger guys that you don't need front lines. That's a whole nother topic for a different discussion, but I feel that ties into why Barrack Zytos is kind of diminished a little bit in his relevance. Now, Dollar Squad, actually, these guys work really well, and I love putting these guys in Cash and Vaughn's deck. And you might not think it at first. They're common. Okay, well, usually rares and epics are good, and that's true. Stat-wise, 5-3. That Survivor 2 is really what sells it for me. And the 5 cost, because if I trigger twice dead and these guys become a 3 cost, and then I drop 2 of these guys, I now have 2 5-3s with 2 Survivor. They're going to survive a defensive satellites. They're likely going to survive 2 artillery strikes and some other ability. They just have longer chances. They've got a 5 attack, so they cannot be returned to hand by Ambassador Melgator. They just are grittier, are beefier, and they have some nice damage. They don't gain anything else. That's all they do. But at that point in the game, that's what I want, at least with Cash and Vaughn. With other decks, it's harder to argue that. There's no sacrifice here. There's no rally. There's nothing that triggers. So it's hard to justify them going into other decks, but I do like them in the Cash and Vaughn deck. I feel like Nemron Phylax should be in most, if not all, Salamanders decks. While it's costly as a 5, and it can be returned to hand by Ambassador Melgator, the healing effect is huge. Basically, you're gaining a benevolence tactic for free from his sacrifice, and it's not too hard to execute that sacrifice at 5 or 6 energy turn in the game because of that 4 health. So that's a very good card to have. I like that card. I think that should stick around. Now, Vulkar Squad is solid in the Survivor and the Health department. Survivor 2, Health 5. That ability to pay 2 and deal 4 damage is strong. And there are decks that run these guys. I think these guys work okay as a common, but I feel like they can be easily replaced. The fact that they can be bounced by Melgator, they can be destroyed with a combination of abilities and Rule of Fear, stunned and not giving you anything, the fact that they have to pay for that ability, it's not great. It's not something huge to rely on, especially at the stage and the pacing that the game is at. So I would rather have a 4-4 that I can just attack with, or a 5-3 straightforward that your opponent has got to burn tactics on. Probably the same amount of tactics that they're going to have to burn to get rid of this guy, but you're not overly investing in anything else. Ancient Deckler got a lot better with his ability. He's worth picking up in the shop. He comes out as a 5-5 with 2 Survivor, because at the end of the turn, he's going to gain that automatically, and he's going to get stronger. He's going to get stronger through his sacrifice, and his Survivor is going to get meatier every single time. Even if you don't trigger your sacrifice on your next turn, he's a Survivor 4, so your opponent has got to break through Daklar's ability plus his 4, and then he's going to be a 6, or just go back up to 5 health, or maybe go back to Survivor 2. Melta Bombs can get rid of him still, just in the same way they can, but he was susceptible to a frag grenade, and that was it. So no longer susceptible to a frag grenade. He feels like a Venerable Dreadnought, or an Ancient, as it were, and I think he works pretty well. I like him a lot. I like him a lot better than I did when he launched. Captain Eusebius, I want to like more because he's got one of the best buff abilities out there. It's a shame that he's a 6/6/5 in the slow faction, but his sacrifice, giving +2/+0 to your other troops, that's all your other troops. If you can keep him alive, either by an escape vent or by stunning your opponent, and your opponent is foolish enough to put down something that he can attack with, and then you drop a bunch of fanatics and make all your fanatics +2/+2, and those are just the cheapy guys. We're not even going into the Cygnus Adept here, or the Ackley and Wordsinger, making her a 5/6, just on the deploy because you triggered Eusebius's ability. Yeah, that's really strong. You got to get to it, and that's what's hard to do, because this is the way the game is worked now. It's harder to execute that. You really have to set that up with an escape vent or some other protection level, and then you still have to have that 5 damage to trigger his sacrifice. But if you get it to work, then the reward is justly earned. Now, Zaith and Pyroclast, these guys can dominate a game if you let them get out of hand. That is for sure. But their cost and their attack value seem out of whack. I would rather them be a 5-3 with 3 survivors, same cost, same effect than 3-5, only because if I can pay 2 for Ambassador Melgator and return your Zaith and Pyroclast, you've lost 6 energy. I've lost 2. That's a better exchange for me. If I pay 2 energy to lower this unit's attack by 1 with Curs and play Rule of Fear, I get rid of that, plus who knows how many other troops you've got. All I paid was 5 energy. For your 6 energy, I can stun them, you can jam them, and then they're just a 3-5. If you play Sabotage on a 6 troop, and pay 1 energy to make your 3-5 just a 3-5, it just... No, if you're going to include it in a deck that is running the Promethean Gift, fantastic, good for you. But if you get stuffed by some of the stuff that can be out there and takes away the value that Zathan can be, don't get too frustrated. These guys are not comfortable to sit back on, and honestly, they never really have been. They never really have been. They've been great if they can go off, and they've always been kind of like, all right, I got it to use his ability 5 times in a combat. That doesn't happen as often as it should, or as often as we'd like. Fire Drakes are really good. They got better too because they got this Battle Honor gain Survivor 2. Before they were just 6-5 with Survivor 3, which was overcosted and didn't do anything. In the same way that these 5-3 guys didn't do anything, at least these guys now have Battle Honor gain Survivor 2. That's really good. They don't have Sacrifice, but they still have Survivor 3. So even if they die destroying something, they have Survivor triggers. They've got 3 health, and then they gain Survivor 2. It works. Perpetual Fire Drakes. So I like these units. I don't know if I feel them as a 2-of in every deck. A 1-of is okay. If you can get these out with Desperate Defense, oof, that's meaty. A 6-5 Survivor 3 with Battle Honor gain Survivor 2 and Frontline. I skip on the Predator Furnace. It's got a great ability, don't get me wrong. 3 to deal 4 damage to an enemy and adjacent units. That's 3 energy to deal 12 damage. That's a really strong ability. But the stats-wise, 7 for that, and then you've got to pay 3 for that. It just... There's no way to protect it. It doesn't have shield. It doesn't have survivor. It doesn't have 7 health. I just don't feel comfortable with it. And at that stage in the game, especially the way the game has progressed, the speed needs to be there. And this is a 2-turn setup for this. And the game doesn't reward that anymore. We're past this point. Predator Furnace is a victim of the times. Udracool is the best hammer of the 2 hammers. This is the one that you want for Vulcan. The problem with the hammers is they feel Vulcan dependent. They don't have to. You can certainly use them in Numian and Cash and Vaughn and Nemator if you want to, but you're not going to gain as much value out of them, whereas Vulcan has got the buffer of his Reckoning to fall back on. He's got that survivor, that continued survivor, maybe with Manifest Destiny, so he can afford to take a 8-attack headshot at a nasty Doombringer and just get rid of it. He can afford to do that because he might do that 2 or 3 times in a game and still be around. Not necessarily the case with anybody else, but this is just instant hard removal. And there's so many things to note about this because it's any troop attacked. They don't have to be damaged. If they have shield, if they have drop pod, they're smashed. They're gone. It doesn't matter. Udracool breaks through and just decimates them. This is just a really good hammer. It's a really good hammer. Should use it on some nails. Ancient Xavier, if you want to take a look at my Cash and Vaughn video, I'm going to reference that a couple times because I tried a lot of these cards out in Cash and Vaughn. I really try to make these guys work. I don't like these guys. They just don't work. They don't. For this stage late in the game, for 8 energy, there's no instant value here. You might have a conditional 9/7. That's it. It doesn't do any damage. It doesn't have any constant effect. It fumbles. It's a fumble epic. Pass on that. Don't pick that up in the shop. Do yourself a favor, don't put that in your deck. Just don't. Arcan. You could you could put that in your Desperate Defense deck if you really wanted to. But there are better cards at that cost. There are better demons that have been around since the set 1 to include at that cost for 8 energy. I would rather have a Yuria the Seducer. I'd rather have Nagahyle. That's right. I'd rather have a Nagahyle frontline than the Xaviers. Not Xavier's, ancient, no, it is Xavier, not Xavier. No, and I'll tell you why. My 8 energy for a 6/6 is bad. Doesn't matter if it has shield. It doesn't matter if it has survivor. This is bad. And yes, it's a common, but by comparison, and again, I don't like doing comparisons, but this is just one of those telltales. By comparison, here's an 8/8 that heals 5. This isn't even, this isn't even a survivor thing. It just heals 5, but it has 2 more attack and 2 more health. Here's one that costs 1 more, but it deals damage as a relentless. Let's look into the word bearers who only have like 1 vehicle or 2 vehicles. Here's an 8 that has a 10/10. Here's an 8 that has a 7/9 with the potential of becoming a 9/11. And what does Salamanders have with this 8 energy? I think this often gets overlooked because just why nobody's playing it. 6/6. Just bad. Pass on that. Dawnbringer is optional. It's not, it's okay. I love putting it on Reckoning Vulcan, like as a late game, like holding it in my hand until I can deal 5 attack with my Warlord. But it's not something I throw out early on. There's definitely a lot more things that you want to play for 9 energy, but if it's going to seal you the game, it is great. Or giving Cleave 2, and taking out that trip that your opponent didn't think that they're going to deal with. It's a good way to go. But it's not required. Forge Father Tekel is a lot better than he used to be. And he's actually, I think, one of the driving forces why Desperate Defense is so good with the Salamanders, especially Vulcan. Because you can pull him out there. If you get him with your Desperate Defense, he's an 8/8 frontline all of a sudden. And then you can just use his ability to draw cards, making them, reducing their cost, maybe making this your second Desperate Defense a 5 energy card, getting more free troops, or just using his beefy 8/8 to attack with. His old ability used to be to draw a card, and if it was a tactic, you could play it for free, and that was it. There was no other act again. That was it. The theme was that you would use him to pull out your hammers and play those for free because he was, helping wield those hammers or giving the hammers to your Warlord. But why do that when you could just use an 8/8 body to smash face? Now he's got a little bit more versatility because he can both smash face, protect face, or just flood the board if you want to in that state of the game. He's much, much better than he used to be. He's worth picking up. I think between Dawnbringer and Forge Father Tekel, I would recommend picking up Forge Father Tekel. A long time ago, I would not have said that. Abraxas is better as an event warlord. It's nice. If your opponent can't deal with it and they've been burned out from everything else, they're going to take, basically a Vengeful Spirit for 3 energy every turn from this. Sure, it's a good exchange. But they are a vehicle. They are susceptible to things that affect vehicles, that stun vehicles, that destroy vehicles, things that capture vehicles, even convert vehicles. I don't see it often, but the fact that Scaramanca is out there in decks and he could just straight take control of that kind of breaks the entire point. If Scaramanca is on the board, why on earth would you play Abraxas? And if Abraxas, you're playing against Iron Warriors, then you're going to probably get hammered with, the old Rack and Ruin. So, I'm going to pass. I'm going to pass on Abraxas, folks. And then we're going to take a look, last but not least, at their counterattack. And the counterattack is very basic here. It's heal 1 to your units. Doesn't seem like a lot because it really isn't, but the fact that it's to your units is nice because late game, if you've got 2 or 3 troops out there, instead of healing 2 to your Warlord or healing 2 to a particular unit, healing 1 to all of those units in conjunction with like a Benevolence or, a Phylax. It's just a great way to support the troop builds, and I think that helps. It's not fantastic, you don't build around it, but it is a nice boost, a little nice boon, and it certainly does help with the Vaughn build, who profits from it the most since he still has low initiative. Vulcan used to have low initiative, and he got up to medium initiative, and he's doing good. So, the Salamanders faction as a whole, right now, I think their prominence is hinging upon a couple decks, Arcology, Desperate Defense, as well as like some creative decks with the Cultist, the Sigma. What is it? It's not Sigmar. The Cygnus Prime Cultists, and they're doing okay. But there's some cards in there that have been completely outdated or that just are no longer playable, and they still suffer from the pacing that they always have suffered. The lack of instant effects, instant damage, instant anything is it hurts them, especially given how the game has progressed, where there's not too many factions that reward that. There's flanking, there's fast, there's ward, there's things that, like, by the time you get the chance to take your action, your opponent has protected themselves or has responded to what you have to offer. So could they use a little bit more tweaking? Absolutely. Are they weak? Not by any means. I think that they can function just fine. I have a lot of fun playing Vaughn, playing Vulcan. I haven't played Numian in a long time, but I played Numian for quite some time. I played him for a couple months before, way back when, and I did really well with him. And he actually, if you play tournaments and you tune into tournaments, the Salamanders do very well for the fact that they've got that durability. They've got access to a very beefy health pool of cards, and they've got some cards that can surprise people. So if you're looking to get into a new faction, or you haven't really checked out the Salamanders, there are a couple warlords worth looking into, primarily Numian. Vulcan, if you can pick him up in the shop when he's on sale, or if you already have Vulcan, you're not going to regret it. I think you're going to feel that they work relatively well. However, they don't play at a quick pace, and you have to adjust yourself to that. So if you're a fast-paced game, or you want some more speedy games, you're not going to get that out of the Salamanders. But yeah, so that's it. That's the card by card for the Salamanders. I think overall, I think they're coming along okay. I don't think that they're underpowered. I don't think that they're overpowered. I think that they're trudging along. I think that the improvements that they've received have helped them. I would like to see them get a few more improvements, though, because there are cards that have just sat in the shadows for far too long. So, all right, guys, that is it for me today. I'm going to go ahead and get this up and done. The next card by card we're going to be taking a look at here is going to be the Raven Guard. And that's the faction that really launched me to the next level, and I'll talk about that when I do that video. So otherwise, that's it for me. Hope that this was interesting to you. If you know somebody who's looking into Salamanders or who wants to try the game out, send them a link to this video. Let them know. Check it out. Send me a like if you like the video. If there's something that you thought of, put it in the comments below, or something you'd like to see. Until then, next time, keep playing Legions. Bye.